Hello and welcome to the first recording on our first presentation, Introduction to Language Testing for Item Writers. So what we're going to be doing in the first week of the course is pretty much a theoretical overview into the background, specifically the theoretical background that item writers will need to produce good items. So we'll be looking at a range of different concepts, touching on ideas such as validity, reliability, standardization. Probably these are terms you have come across before. You may already be familiar with some of them, but we're going to be going into a bit more detail and look at them especially from the perspective of item writing and how that particular job contributes to the validation of a test or to the internal consistency or the reliability of a test and so on. So we'll be looking at the position of item writing in the test development cycle. So you're probably familiar as examiners as one part of that cycle. Item writing is at a different stage, and we'll be looking at how examiners and item writers and everybody fits together into the whole process. And also introduce you to some terminology to do with item writing. So when we talk about test specifications, for example, all the terminology they contain, such as STEM, distractor, K-level, readability, index, and so on, you'll be familiar with what these mean. So, what I'd like to do then is begin perhaps with the most basic question of all and think, what is a test? If you had to define it in a single sentence, what is a test? Here is one definition. So this is essentially saying that we are eliciting behaviour from a test taker, and then based upon that behaviour we're going to make inferences, i.e. scores, which are interpreted as levels, about the characteristics of an individual, so language ability in this case. However, in true academic style, we have here quite an academic definition. I'm going to give you now another definition that shows it's not quite as complicated as it may seem. So I prefer to think of a test as being in two stages. So first of all, any test has to have a task, a way of eliciting a performance, of getting learners to perform in the language being tested. So that's essentially the first part of what a test is. It's essentially a task to act as an elicitation device. The second part of that is a set procedure for evaluating that performance, and this needs to involve criteria, otherwise probably known as rating scales. So as examiners, you're probably very familiar with this second stage. So you will be evaluating a spoken performance, a written performance, you will be matching it against descriptors in a rating scale, and placing test takers on that scale accordingly. Item writers are much more involved in that first stage. So, writing the task, producing the task that will get this performance out of the test taker. So, this is quite a useful metaphor, I think, when we think about testing. A test is essentially, earlier in the previous slide I referred to it as an elicitation device, but essentially it's a measurement device, just like any other. So as humans, I think it seems we have a need to categorize and order everything around us. So we measure many things, height, weight, length being three obvious examples, also temperature as well, and we have set units for doing that. So we have centimeters, we have miles, we have kilometers, we have Celsius, Fahrenheit, we have stones, pounds, kilograms. But these are all set. Everybody agrees what a centimetre is. Everybody agrees what a mile is. But when we talk about language ability, that's a bit more flexible. That's a bit more open to interpretation. And this is why we refer to language testing essentially as a rubber ruler. So it's not necessarily a reliable measurement unless we have a very set and standardized procedure that we follow. It's going to be elastic and we're going to get different measurements. So just as if you weighed yourself on two different sets of scales and they give you two different measurements, then you will suspect that something is wrong with one of those scales, and you'll go to a third one, and then you'll see which one is less accurate. And testing's the same. If you take one test, you'd expect to get a similar mark, or a mark that indicates a similar level of ability if you take another test. And where there isn't alignment, this is where it can be a bit flexible and where there may be issues in the development. So in order to make sure that our ruler is not rubber, to make sure that our ruler is as standardized as we possibly can, language tests go through a development cycle, which you can see now on the slide in front of you. So they will begin with a planning phase. There will be a needs analysis, deciding who needs to be tested, who are the target test takers, what are the scores going to be used for. And then when we get this information, we can move into the design phase. This is where we start coming up with specifications. So we know who the test takers are, we know what kinds of tasks we want to get them to perform. And now the question is defining those tasks, and this is what the specifications do. And using those initial specifications, we will move into the development phase, and this is where item writers come in. So they will produce tasks, but that's not the end of the process. Once the tasks have been quality assured, that doesn't mean that they're ready for live testing. You can see here in that development phase, there are still 3 stages they need to go through: trialing, analysis, review. So what this means is that once the items have been produced, once they've been quality assured, we know that we think they are okay, but they still haven't been tested on a real person, and this is what trialing is for. So we will give them to dummy candidates, they will take the tasks, and then the results are analysed. So they will look at whether the tasks are at the appropriate level of difficulty. They will look at whether they are discriminating properly between strong takers and between strong test takers and weak test takers. And if there are any issues, then that can be modified and revised accordingly. So you can see the process is sort of cyclical. So once we're happy with the specifications, we can start this process of producing items, quality assuring them, putting them forward for trialing, and then they will go into an item bank, so that when an operational test needs new materials, they can draw upon those items that have been pre-tested, they've been trialed, they've been quality assured. We know that they are as valid and as reliable as we can possibly make them, and hopefully our measurement will be as accurate as possible. And then even after that, even after the live test has been taken, there's still another monitoring phase to see if there still needs to be any further review or evaluation. So here's a more distilled way of looking at it, we can say. So this is the process. So starting from what is being tested, all the way through the design phase, the development phase. As teachers, you will probably come in at that test preparation phase at the top, taking the test here. Especially if it's a high-stakes test, you're going to need invigilators. You're going to need to have You're going to need to ensure that the test is taken in a secure environment. Scoring the test, this is where the examiners obviously come in. And then importantly, using those scores to make decisions. We'll go into this in a bit more detail in the validity section, of this week's tasks, but essentially that's a very important point, is using the scores to make decisions, because the key point to remember is that a test is not in and of itself either good or bad, either valid or invalid. It all depends on how it is used and how those scores are interpreted to make decisions. And if a test is used for a score, if a test is used for a purpose it was not designed for, then it's going to fall out of sync with this cycle, and it's likely to produce an inaccurate measurement, hence the rubber ruler. So, from the item writer's perspective, how do they ensure that the tasks they are producing contribute towards that internal validity, consistency of a test? So, first of all, a certain amount of theoretical knowledge is required, and an awareness of the language skill being tested. So different reading tasks, different listening tasks will target different sub-processes involved cognitively in the reading or listening process, and being aware of what the task is trying to get the candidates to do cognitively can really help produce better items. So a degree of assessment literacy is needed in that regard, understanding how the language skill being targeted is contributing towards that internal reliability. Adhering to task specifications sounds simple, not necessarily so. We try to make them as precise as we can, but even so, things can be open to interpretation. So if we talk about inferred meaning, for example, rather than something that's explicitly stated, so where exactly we draw that line between something that's explicit and something that's inferred, or something that's just too difficult, something that's just interpretative, it's not clear, then these can muddy the waters a little bit, and this is what the quality review process is for. And using the same, what I've called here, measurement tools. So we want to make sure that we are on the same page, so that the corpora we use are the same. So when we look at word lists, to have a when we're looking at which words have been assigned to particular levels, we'll go into this a bit more detail later, we need to be using the same list. So the corpus we use in Aptis is the British National Corpus, the BNC. There are other ones, like the Corpus of Contemporary American English, COCA. That gives you completely different readings. So if you have one item writer who's checking their lexical level with the BNC and another one who is checking their lexical level with COCA, then you're going to get inconsistent results. And the same for readability calculators. There are a range of different ways to calculate readability, most of which give you different results. Syllable counters shouldn't be variable in theory, but in practice I've noticed they actually are. Same for word count. So we need to be using the same ones to ensure that we are all on the same page. So this is where the specifications come in, and the specifications are essentially defining the construct. So your construct is your theory, essentially, of what's being tested, of what language is. If you want to test language, then you have to know what language is, essentially. So we need to define what we mean by language ability. Similarly, when we say that somebody can read or somebody can speak very fluently, we need to have a very clear definition of what this actually means. And it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. So if we think about reading, for example, what is going on in somebody's mind as they are reading? What kinds of cognitive processes are they going through? And how can we best design tasks that reflect that process? So in terms of a theory of language, at least, we are veering very much now towards communicative competence. I'll just give you a moment to maybe pause the video and look at this slide. But essentially, this is showing that language knowledge is split into a variety of different areas. So traditionally, language tests were focused on grammatical knowledge over there on the left. So if your theory of language is knowing about grammar, then your language test is going to be very heavily grammar-based. And essentially, language tests were for many years. But now, we have been moving towards a more communicative understanding of language, and we understand that there are many other aspects involved. So here over on the right, you can see pragmatic knowledge, socio-linguistic knowledge. So all of these social factors that feature into how we speak. So not just how we say something, but why we say something and the way in which we say it. That's all relevant. So if we think about the construct of reading, we have our construct of language. We can narrow that down to think about the construct of reading. So what kinds of skills do we need to target? So here are some examples. You've come across this before, these phrases, I'm sure. And this is what we need to make sure item writers are doing. So when we're reading for inference, for example, we have to make sure that that information is there, it can be inferred, but also that it's a fair test, that you couldn't interpret it in any different ways, because there can only be one answer if we want to make sure it's consistent. Similarly for listening, here are some of the processes you may want to test with a listening task. So accent, for example, is a very interesting question in terms of listening. Traditionally, native speaker accents have been used, but that doesn't mirror necessarily the real-life situation of the world in the era of global English, when test takers arguably should be familiar or should be able to comprehend a variety of different accents if they can say they understand English in this day. So in order to do that then, in order to make sure that the items are producing, that the items that item writers are producing are targeting the right construct, be it of an overarching construct of language or one of the sub-constructs involved in sub-skills to do with listening or reading, we need documents that we call specifications. So you could compare it to an airplane specification, essentially. So an aeroplane, I think they are built in many different parts. I believe Airbus, at least, have the wings produced in Wales. I think the engines are produced by Rolls-Royce somewhere in the UK. The body is produced in mainland Europe somewhere. And then all of these parts have to come together, and they need to measure exactly, otherwise they're not going to fit. And it's essentially the same for a test task. So we need to be giving item writers the information that they can produce exactly the right kind of model. So if we think about the specifications that need to be included in a test task, what might come up? Perhaps you can pause the video for a moment and think about it. But what needs to be included in a test task specification to ensure that if you give them to two different item writers, they will produce a task that is different, but consistently targeting the same construct? So here are just some examples. So for the language level, so the level of lexis you can use, the level of grammar you can use, the genre, the length of the text, how many words the text should be, and not only the text but the questions as well, the language level of the text, the language level of the questions. These all need to be very clearly defined in order to ensure that the tasks being produced are consistently producing items which mirror the target construct. And this is essentially the job of the item writer, to understand the construct being targeted and to follow the test specifications to produce items that target those constructs. So I'm going to finish by leaving you with some useful websites. We're going to go into these in more detail during the course itself, but it may be useful just to have a quick look at them to begin with. So for lexical level, we have been using a website called lextutor.ca and the vocab profile within that. For readability, we use a website called cometrics.com. And another website we use is syllablecount.com for listening tasks. So we'll go into these in more detail later on the course, but for now you can go on, have a look, and try and get a sense of how they are useful to us in producing consistent tasks. Thank you very much. That's all from me for this presentation. If you have any questions, please post them into the discussion list at the bottom. Thank you.